What would you do if a lifetime of sacrifice was dismissed as worthless junk? Picture this: a veteran's sacred medals, symbols of courage, loss, and honor, being sneered at as fake trinkets by a cold-hearted pawn shop owner. On a bustling city street in San Diego, this shocking moment unfolded, pulling at the heartstrings of everyone who believes in the true value of service. At 72, Sergeant Major Thomas J. Carter, a retired U.S. Navy SEAL, stood in a dimly lit pawn shop, his weathered hands trembling as he faced an unbearable choice. If you believe in the power of honor, you're in for a story that will leave you breathless. Thomas J. Carter, a man whose face bore the deep lines of decades of service, carried himself with a quiet dignity despite his threadbare jacket and faded jeans. He'd survived missions that would haunt most people's dreams, diving into icy waters, defusing underwater mines, and leading teams through enemy territory with nothing but skill and grit. Now, living on a modest Navy pension, he faced a new battle: the rising cost of living and a sudden $600 car repair bill that threatened his independence. Desperate, he turned to his most cherished possessions, his service medals. At Daily Narrated Stories, we're honored to share this tale of resilience and justice. We invite you to show your love for our country and gratitude for veterans' sacrifices in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, please subscribe. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and your support means the world to us. Thomas J. Carter had spent 32 years as a Navy SEAL, a Master Chief Petty Officer who operated in the shadows, executing missions that demanded precision, bravery, and silence. His hands, rough and scarred, could still assemble a rifle in seconds or tie a knot in pitch darkness. But the challenges of civilian life, unexpected medical expenses, a leaking roof, and now a broken car, were proving harder than any battlefield. He lived alone in a small apartment, its walls bare except for a single photograph of his old SEAL team, a reminder of the brothers he'd lost. The photograph, faded and curling at the edges, showed a group of young men in their prime, their faces lit with the kind of camaraderie that only comes from facing death together. Thomas often found himself staring at it late at night, the silence of his apartment broken only by the distant hum of a neighbor's television. Each face in that photo carried a story: a laugh shared over a campfire, a quiet moment of prayer before a mission, a final goodbye whispered in the chaos of battle. Selling his medals felt like betraying their memory, but with his car, the lifeline to his VA appointments and grocery runs, sitting unusable in his driveway, he had no choice. The decision to pawn his medals hadn't come easily. Thomas had spent weeks wrestling with the idea, pacing his small living room, the creak of the floorboards echoing his restless thoughts. He'd tried everything else, cutting back on groceries, skipping his morning coffee at the diner down the street, even selling an old radio he'd kept since his first deployment. But the bills kept piling up, each one a silent reminder of how far he'd fallen from the man he once was. The car repair was the final blow. Without it, he couldn't make the 30-mile trip to the VA hospital for his monthly checkups, nor could he drive to the store to buy the essentials that kept him going. He'd always prided himself on his self-reliance, a trait that had served him well in the SEALs, but now, at 72, he felt the weight of his years pressing down on him, heavier than any rucksack he'd ever carried. The pawn shop, Fast Cash Trades, was a grim place, its air thick with the scent of mildew and despair. Dusty shelves held forgotten relics, old guitars, chipped porcelain, and tarnished jewelry, each item a silent story of someone's desperation. The flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the cracked linoleum floor. A faint draft slipped through the gaps in the window frames, carrying the distant scent of salt water from the nearby harbor. Behind the counter stood Marco, the owner, a wiry man with slicked-back hair and eyes that gleamed with opportunism. His fingers, stained with nicotine, tapped impatiently on the counter as he sized up Thomas. Marco had seen plenty of desperate people in his years running the shop, but something about this old man, his straight posture, the way his hands moved with a quiet precision, made him pause, if only for a moment. He quickly shook off the feeling, his cynicism returning like a well-worn coat. "What's an old guy like you got for me?" he asked, wiping a smudged watch with a rag, his tone dripping with boredom. Thomas placed a velvet-lined shadow box on the counter, his heart heavy as he opened it to reveal a bronze star, a purple heart, and several unit citations. The medals glinted faintly under the shop's flickering lights, each one a memory etched in blood and sweat. The bronze star, its surface scratched but still proud, had been awarded after a grueling mission in the Persian Gulf, where Thomas had led his team through a minefield under enemy fire to extract a downed pilot. The purple heart, its edges worn from years of careful handling, bore the scars of that night in 1987, a night he'd never forget. The unit citations, pinned neatly beside the medals, were a testament to the countless operations he'd survived, each one a thread in the tapestry of his service. As Thomas looked at them, he could almost hear the roar of helicopter blades, the crack of gunfire, the shouts of his teammates echoing in his ears. These weren't just pieces of metal. They were pieces of his soul, markers of a life lived in service to something greater than himself. Marco's eyes flicked over the medals, his lip curling in disdain. "Military junk, huh? Unless it's pure gold, this stuff's worthless," he scoffed, tossing the purple heart back into the box with a clatter that made Thomas flinch. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet shop, a stark reminder of how far these sacred objects had fallen in Marco's estimation. "What kind of hero pawns his own medals? You trying to scam me, old man?" Marco's voice was sharp, his sneer cutting deeper than any wound Thomas had ever endured. The accusation stung, not because Thomas cared what Marco thought of him, but because it struck at the core of his identity. He'd spent his life proving his honor, his loyalty, his courage, qualities this man couldn't begin to understand. For a moment, Thomas's mind flashed to the faces of his fallen comrades, men who'd trusted him with their lives, men who'd never made it home. What would they think of him now, standing here, letting their sacrifices be mocked? "I need $600 for a car repair," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "It's all I've got left." Marco barked a laugh, cold and hollow, the sound echoing off the shop's peeling walls. "$600? For these faded ribbons and scrap metal? I'll give you $60, maybe, if I'm feeling nice." "Fake trinkets like these don't fetch more than that," he said, shoving the box back across the counter. The metals slid against each other, the sound a dagger to Thomas's heart. Fake trinkets. The words echoed in his mind, stirring a memory of a night in 1987, pinned down in a jungle, his best friend bleeding out in his arms as he earned that purple heart. The air had been thick with the scent of gunpowder and rain, the sounds of gunfire and his friend's ragged breaths filling the night. Thomas had dragged him to safety, shrapnel tearing into his own leg, refusing to leave a brother behind. The faces of fallen comrades flashed before him, their laughter, their courage, reduced to nothing by this man who saw only profit. He could still feel the weight of his friend's body in his arms, the warmth of blood seeping through his uniform, the desperate prayers he'd whispered as he carried him through the darkness. That night had cost him more than the wound in his leg. It had cost him a piece of his heart, a piece he'd never get back. A wave of nausea hit Thomas, followed by a searing anger he hadn't felt since his last mission. The anger was a fire in his chest, burning through the layers of restraint he'd built over the years. He clenched his fists, the scars on his knuckles whitening as he fought to keep his composure. But beneath the anger was a deeper pain, a grief for the sacred memories Marco had defiled. Each medal in that box was a story, a sacrifice, a moment of courage in the face of unimaginable odds. To hear them dismissed so callously was like watching his life's work crumble to dust. He closed the box with deliberate care, the soft click of final refusal to let this man taint his legacy. "Thank you for your time," Thomas said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a man who'd faced death, and walked away. Marco paused, caught off guard by the quiet authority, but quickly masked it with another sneer. "Don't waste my time again, old man," he muttered, turning back to his watch as if Thomas had never been there. Thomas stepped outside, the city's noise washing over him as he walked to a weathered bench near a bus stop. He sat, the shadow box resting beside him, and stared at the cracked pavement. The sun beat down, its heat mixing with the exhaust fumes from passing cars. The distant hum of traffic, a stark contrast to the storm in his mind. Without the car, he was trapped. No VA visits, no trips to the store, just a man fading into his own shadow. The thought gnawed at him, a quiet fear he'd never admit aloud. He'd faced death without flinching, but the idea of losing his independence, of becoming a burden, chilled him to the bone. He thought of his late wife, Margaret, who'd passed 5 years ago, her gentle smile a memory that both comforted and pained him. She'd always been his anchor, the one who'd kept him grounded after he retired, who'd reminded him that he was more than his missions. What would she say now, seeing him like this, reduced to begging for scraps from a man who couldn't begin to understand his worth? Selling the medals was no longer an option, not after that insult. But the disrespect Marco had shown, not just to him, but to the very idea of service, burned in his chest. It wasn't just about the medals. It was about what they represented, the ideals he'd fought for, the men he'd fought beside. He couldn't let it stand. He pulled out his old flip phone, its screen scratched and dim, and scrolled to a contact labeled Alpha 2. His thumb hovered over the call button, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind. Was he overreacting? Should he just let it go? Find another way to fix the car? But then he thought of the faces in that photograph on his wall, the men who'd given everything for their country, and he knew he couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about him. It was about them. Alpha 2 was Commander James Hawk Larson, Thomas's last commanding officer, a man 12 years his junior who revered Thomas's legendary career. They hadn't spoken in years, but Thomas needed someone who understood the weight of those medals, the shared bond of sacrifice. The phone rang twice, each ring stretching into eternity as Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. Hawk, came the sharp, familiar voice, cutting through the noise of the city. Commander Larson, sir, it's Sergeant Major Carter, Thomas said, his tone measured but heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. Thomas, Master Chief. It's an honor to hear from you, Larson replied, his voice warming instantly, a stark contrast to the coldness Thomas had just endured. What's wrong? Thomas recounted the encounter in precise detail. The desperate need, the medals, Marco's words, fake trinkets, scrap metal, scamming me, and the casual cruelty. As he spoke, he could hear the anger building in Larson's silence, a tension that mirrored his own. It's a disgrace to the uniform, sir, Thomas concluded, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. Larson's silence was heavy, the kind that preceded action, the kind Thomas had heard countless times before mission. Fake trinkets, Larson repeated, his voice now a low growl, the warmth replaced by steel. Are you still near the shop, Sergeant Major? Yes, sir, on a bench down the street, Thomas replied, giving the address and Marco's name. Stay there, Thomas. Don't move, Larson said, his tone laced with a quiet intensity that Thomas recognized from countless missions. I'm finishing a briefing at Naval Base San Diego. You'll see soon enough. The line went dead. Thomas sat, uncertainty creeping in. You'll see soon enough. What did that mean? He glanced at the shadow box, its edges worn from years of careful handling, and waited, the minutes stretching with unspoken questions. The city buzzed around him, cars honking, a street vendor calling out, the faint smell of grilled hot dogs in the air. But Thomas's mind was elsewhere. He thought of his old team, the missions they'd survived together, the ones they hadn't. What would they think of him now, sitting here, unable to fix a simple car? The doubt gnawed at him, a quiet ache beneath his resolve. He thought of the last time he'd seen Larson, at a retirement ceremony years ago. The younger man's eyes filled with respect as he'd saluted Thomas one final time. Larson had always understood the weight of their shared history. Would he understand now? As the minutes ticked by, Thomas's thoughts drifted to his early days as a SEAL, the grueling training that had forged him into the man he was. He remembered the first time he'd earned a commendation, a a small ribbon for a mission in the South China Sea, a seemingly simple operation that had gone horribly wrong. They'd been tasked with retrieving classified documents from a sunken vessel, but the currents were stronger than expected, and one of his teammates had nearly drowned. Thomas had dived back in, his lungs burning as he pulled the man to safety, the icy water numbing his limbs. That ribbon, though small, had been his first taste of what it meant to lead, to sacrifice, to carry the weight of others' lives on his shoulders. Now, sitting on this bench, that same weight pressed down on him, but in a different form. He wasn't fighting currents or enemy fire. He was fighting the slow, grinding erosion of time, of poverty, of a society that too often forgot the men who'd given everything for its freedom. Exactly 45 minutes later, the street's rhythm shattered. It wasn't a siren or a lone car. It was a shift in the air, a tension that made pedestrians pause. Two black SUVs rolled into view, parking discreetly at each end of the block. Men in dark suits stepped out, their movements precise as they scanned the area, establishing a silent perimeter. Their presence was subtle but unmistakable, a ripple of authority that made the hair on the back of Thomas's neck stand up. Then, from around the corner, came a sight that stopped traffic. 3 U.S. Navy transport vans, their doors emblazoned with official seals. The vans moved with purpose, their engines a low growl as they pulled up directly in front of fast cash trades. The street seemed to hold its breath, the usual cacophony of city life fading into a hushed anticipation. The lead van's doors slid open, and out stepped a dozen men in full operational uniform. Tactical pants, combat shirts, boots, and vests, their presence a stark contrast to the city's chaos. They were Navy SEALs, moving with a silent, synchronized precision that spoke of years of training. Their faces were set, their movements deliberate, each step a testament to the discipline that had been drilled into them. Traffic slowed, phones emerged, and whispers rippled through the crowd. A mother with a stroller stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide as she pulled her child closer. A group of teenagers on skateboards paused, their laughter dying as they watched the scene unfold. Inside fast cash trades, Marco looked up from his counter, his smirk fading as he saw the commotion through the grimy windows. For a moment, he thought it might be a parade, a publicity stunt, something he could scoff at. But as the SEALs formed up on the sidewalk, their boots hitting the pavement in perfect unison, a flicker of fear crossed his face. He'd seen cops before, even the occasional federal agent, but this was something different, something far more dangerous. Commander Larson led the unit, his face set in a stern mask as he locked eyes on the pawn shop's entrance. He was flanked by chief petty officers, their expressions unreadable under tactical caps. Larson's presence was commanding, his broad shoulders and steely gaze a reminder of the leader he'd always been. Thomas watched from the bench, his heart pounding as memories of past missions flooded back. Larson's voice barking orders over the radio, the feel of sand beneath his boots, the adrenaline of a firefight. Larson's gaze swept the street, finding Thomas on the bench. He gave a subtle nod, a gesture of respect that spoke volumes, a silent promise that justice was coming. Then, with deliberate steps, the SEAL unit marched into fast cash trades, their boots echoing like a drumbeat of justice on the worn pavement. Inside, the few customers froze, their eyes wide. A young woman clutching a pawned necklace stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. An older man with a cane stood rooted to the spot, his hands trembling as he watched the SEALs enter. Marco's face paled as the SEALs fanned out, their presence filling the cramped space with an intensity that needed no words. The air seemed to thicken, the flickering lights casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Larson stopped at the counter, his voice calm but commanding, cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "Are you Marco, the owner?" he asked. Marco nodded, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard, his earlier bravado evaporating under the weight of Larson's gaze. "I'm Commander James Larson, United States Navy, commanding officer, SEAL Team 5, Larson said, his tone sharp and unyielding. Marco's eyes widened. He knew the name, the unit, the weight of what stood before him. SEAL Team 5 was legendary, a unit that had seen action in some of the most dangerous corners of the world, a unit that didn't show up for trivial matters. Moments ago, Larson continued, his voice dropping with controlled fury. A revered member of my naval family, Sergeant Major Thomas Carter, a Master Chief Petty Officer with 32 years of service, came to your shop seeking help. You dismissed his medals, earned through blood, sweat, and the lives of men who never came home, as fake trinkets and scrap metal. You accused him of scamming you and told him to get out. Larson gestured to Thomas, who had entered quietly, the shadow box under his arm. Thomas's presence in the doorway was a quiet contrast to the SEAL's imposing force, but there was a strength in his stillness, a dignity that filled the room. Sergeant Major Carter is a legend in our community, a man of unparalleled honor. The value of those medals is beyond your comprehension. Larson's words were measured, each one a hammer blow to Marco's crumbling facade. The customers in the shop exchanged glances, their whispers barely audible as they realized the gravity of what was happening. Marco stammered, his voice trembling, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. I didn't know, sir. He looked like just an old man in need. His words were feeble, a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Larson's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he leaned in slightly, his presence towering over the counter. And you chose disrespect over decency, ignorance over honor, he said sharply, his voice cutting through Marco's excuses like a knife. The United States Navy does not tolerate its veterans being mocked by opportunists like you. Effective immediately, this establishment is under administrative hold pending a full review by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Your business license will be scrutinized by the city. He turned to a chief petty officer, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, who nodded in acknowledgement. Chief, secure the premises. Liaise with NCIS. They're on their way. The chief stepped forward, his movements crisp and efficient, as the other SEALs began to systematically catalog the shop's contents, their gloved hands moving with the precision of men who'd done this 100 times before. Larson faced Thomas, his expression softening, the fury in his eyes replaced by a deep respect. Master Chief, I'm sorry you endured such disrespect. It's unacceptable, he said, glancing at the shadow box with a reverence that mirrored Thomas's own. Those medals are your legacy, one we honor deeply. You needed $600 for your car? Thomas nodded, his throat tight with emotion, tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. Yes, sir. Transmission repair. Larson pulled out his wallet without hesitation, the gesture so natural it seemed almost instinctive. Consider it handled, Thomas. A small token from a grateful command. The Naval Special Warfare Foundation will also step in. You'll never have to sell your history again. Thomas could barely speak, the weight of Larson's words washing over him like a balm. For the first time that day, he felt seen, understood, valued, not as an old man in need, but as the warrior he'd always been. The SEALs moved through fast cash trades, their silent efficiency a stark contrast to Marco's earlier arrogance. Outside, NCIS agents and city officials arrived, drawn by Larson's swift action. Marco's world collapsed. His shop was shut down after the review uncovered multiple violations, and he faced fines and legal consequences. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marco stood alone in the empty shop, the shelves bare, the air heavy with the scent of dust and regret. He stared at the spot where Thomas's shadow box had sat, the weight of his own cruelty sinking in. He'd lost everything, not because of a crime, but because he'd failed to see the true value of a man's honor. For Thomas, the story became a beacon of hope. His car was repaired, a fund was established in his name to support struggling veterans, and he kept his medals, now symbols of the unbreakable bond between SEALs across generations. Commander Larson visited Thomas in the months that followed, not as a commander, but as a brother in arms. Over coffee in Thomas's small apartment, they shared stories of missions past, their laughter a quiet tribute to those who didn't make it home. The scent of brewed coffee mingled with the warmth of their camaraderie, a reminder that some bonds could never be broken. Where fast cash trades once stood, a plaque now reads, "Honor is not measured in wealth, but in the courage to serve. Respect those who gave all." This story reminds us that true value lies in the sacrifices we make for others, the loyalty we show in the face of adversity, and the courage to stand for what's right. Thomas's journey from despair to redemption speaks to the resilience of veterans and the power of community. It's a testament to the enduring brotherhood of those who serve, a bond that transcends time and hardship. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. How can you honor the veterans in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories of gratitude and love for those who've served. At Daily Narrated Stories, we're committed to sharing tales that inspire, uplift, and remind us of the values that bind us. But we can't do it without you. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and your support can make it happen today. Don't miss this chance. Subscribe now, leave a comment, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Time is fleeting, and your action matters. Let's honor our veterans together, right now, with Daily Narrated Stories.